Hello and welcome to the F1 Strategy Report, powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. My name's Michael Lamonato, and this is round 16, the Russian Grand Prix. Another must-win race for Sebastian Vettel has ended in another Lewis Hamilton victory, but this time even Hamilton himself wasn't happy with the outcome. Mercedes intervened with team orders to move Valtteri Bottas aside for the sake of the Britain's Championship campaign, but with Hamilton now 50 points ahead of Vettel, was it really necessary? To help analyse F1's latest team orders debate and whatever else happened in the Russian Grand Prix, I'm joined by Rob James from F1 podcast Box of Neutrals. Rob, how are you doing?
Das Vidania, Michael.
Some great original Russian.
Can I offer you some borscht?
Oh, it sounds delicious. Whatever it is. I always thought they manufactured washing machines.
Well, that's the extent of the Russian that I know.
That's fine.
I drove you here in my Lada as well. So.
You're committed. You're committed to the cause. That's what we look for in guests.
Yes.
For the strategy report.
Are you cold as well? Can I offer you this lead blanket? It helps with the radiation.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
You can't say that. Cut this out.
It's already been said. It's out there now. It's gone live to podcast. So this was the sixth last race of the season, the Russian Grand Prix. It was billed essentially as a must-win Grand Prix for Sebastian Vettel. He did not win the must-win Grand Prix. Ferrari didn't have the fastest car in the way they sort of have for the last good few months. Is this just a typical Ferrari conclusion to a season?
No, because someone hasn't been sacked yet. Kimi Räikkönen is just out of contract. He's just going to another team. Yes. Ferrari for the last few seasons, yes, they have lost the ball in terms of the championship aspirations. But this year, it doesn't seem like any kind of team error. I think we spoke off air about how Sebastian Vettel on his own accord has lost over 2 race wins worth of points. 50, nearly 60 odd points.
Yeah.
So some of it has to be attributed back to him as well. But I think Ferrari did everything right in terms of the race, which I'm sure we'll talk into in a few moments' time. Much better than it was in Singapore. But Mercedes, yet again, seemed to have the quicker car on race day, which, to be fair, has swung, either in Mercedes or Ferrari's favour at different points of the year. But if this were a game of tennis, championship point for Lewis Hamilton in Russia.
Yeah, it's felt like it's been championship point for a while. It's sort of like they've had to go back and forth, almost like a tie-break, except there's no chance Sebastian Vettel will win the tie-break in this situation. Or at least probably there isn't. We should say that much. Both teams brought upgrades to this race. It seemed to work a whole lot better for Mercedes. Now, certainly the Sochi circuit is not... I mean, I feel like we say this about every track, though. It's not a typical circuit, but it is a little bit unusual. We know it's extremely smooth. All the kind of standard new Tilke sort of street circuit rules apply here. But were you surprised by just how far off the pace Ferrari was, even before the weekend seemed to start? Normally they're at least thereabouts. And though while on race pace they were fairly close, in qualifying you never really felt like they were ever going to be in contention.
I think they were lucky that Red Bull were very much behind the 8 ball in terms of their engine penalties. Yeah. I think had they gone in there with a normal mindset and not taken a raft of penalties for that weekend, I don't think we probably would have seen a Ferrari on the podium, such was their pace. But if you look at the history of the Russian Grand Prix, Mercedes, the most dominant team in the Russian Grand Prix living history, 100% winning streak since the first Grand Prix in 2014?
Yeah, and even if you want to, as like a fun trivia fact, there were pre-war races in Russia, pre-championship races, also won by Mercedes.
Well, there you go. So over 2 centuries, Mercedes...
Centuries of tradition.
That's 100% winning streak in 2 centuries. What other mark can claim that feat? But yes and no, I was surprised by how far behind Ferrari were, but going into the weekend knowing the history, you weren't surprised. But I think by the margin that they were, I'm surprised they weren't a bit closer.
Mm-hmm. Looking a little bit at the background of this race itself and what the teams were faced with, same tyre allocation as in Singapore: hyper soft, ultra soft, and soft. The soft was the hardest tyre. Always like saying that. It's always enjoyable to say that. But we had this weird situation. I mean, we're very much at the end of the season, obviously. We've got 5 races to go, so we're well past into the final third. And so we're starting to get to this point now where power unit penalties are very much starting to bite certain teams, particularly the experimental teams, if you like. Honda and Renault especially felt it. And in this situation, it was Red Bull Racing. Both drivers took new B-spec power units, because apparently the C-Spec can't deal with high altitudes that they'll be facing in Mexico and Brazil, go figure. And also Pierre Gasly and Brendan Hartley for Honda were taking a whole lot of power unit grid penalties. And this led to this really interesting and unusual situation. Formula One always has a way of developing them without even realizing it, where because Gasly and the two Red Bull drivers all qualified in Q2, but knew they were going to get a penalty and start at the back anyway, they chose not to run. And then Renault, which knew they weren't really fast enough to qualify in the top 10 either, also chose not to run. So everyone in the top 10, well, they really didn't even have to do more than one lap because they were automatically through. But it was essentially like a redundant session. It's not exactly what you tune into to see in Formula One racing.
No, and it was very cheeky of those four Renault-powered teams to take part in qualifying, knock out some teams who normally... Let someone else have a go. If you know you're going to be starting plumb last... for this race. I think Dan Ricciardo was supposed to be last. He started the race 17th. Not even that. I think he even started higher than that, perhaps. But it was pretty funny to see the other teams just not take part in Q2 just because they could. They were so quick. I think they were well within the top 5. I think were Red Bull Racing, which on the earlier points, Ferrari were quite lucky that Red Bull were quite behind. They had those raft of penalties.
Mm-hmm. And so it was strategic as much as anything else. Obviously, they didn't want to run any extra laps on these power units that don't work. So strategic from that point of view. But also for Renault, who saw this, I suppose cleverly, if you like, as an opportunity not only to not do any extra mileage on their engines, but also because we had this controversy, I suppose you could call it, after Singapore, where drivers in the midfield in particular, the front runners are obviously on a completely different class to everybody else in Formula One at the moment, but the midfield drivers who qualified in the top 10 had to start on their hypersofts, were at a supreme disadvantage compared to those who qualified just outside the top 10 but on better tyres. They could start the race on whatever tyres they liked. So Renault all of a sudden had a guaranteed way to qualify 11th and 12th and therefore choose their own tyres, which was by not setting any laps. This is something Romain Grosjean in particular during the week raised as he thought as an issue because he was one of the drivers in Singapore who was badly affected by it. I mean, is there anything we can do in this situation? We know the rules were changed so that Q3 would be more exciting, but has it now swung a bit much the other way and it's actually affecting the race in a negative fashion?
Well, it's very much a case of qualifying almost doesn't matter. You could have Lewis Hamilton starting from the back of the grid and he could still win a Grand Prix. So in terms of race pace, the teams that are always going to be quicker are just going to be quick anyway. So it makes for an exciting 10 or so laps, but then you factor in DRS when that's open, all the energy recovery passes that we have. It's sort of okay. That was 5 laps of entertainment. We're back to square one as if qualifying had actually happened. So, which is a shame because qualifying should not be a waste of time. I don't want to see cars just set one lap just because they have to, or just feel obliged to do it. We want there to be some kind of incentive, and it's an hour of television. Let's face it. I don't think that makes a great TV.
So, we've already had these qualifying changes before. Of course, I can't remember what year it was because it was such a brief moment of time. Was it
the current format? 2006. We had one-shot qualifying from about till the end of 2005. I think it was because the typhoon, and hopefully there is not another typhoon episode this weekend in Japan, but I think it was because the teams then had to qualify on the Sunday morning of the race. We saw this weird 2-tiered qualifying system where we qualified on Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning before a Grand Prix. That didn't last very long. No. And then we had the 3-tiered sort of system. I think, again, this may be some kind of Formula One internet forum rumor that I read in 2006. Apparently the idea came from a mechanic or someone who just bumped into Bernie Ecclestone into a hotel room in the hotel. Oh, really? And said, I've got an idea for you, Bernie. Take this one. And instead of just nodding and smiling politely like most people do, he actually said, that's a bloody brilliant idea and we'll do that. And that's the qualifying system we've all come to know and love. And I think we've been quite, skeptical in terms of wanting to change it because it's actually been the best system we've had for a while. Maybe not the most perfect system, but it's been, on average, it's produced some pretty thrilling qualifying sessions in its day. And I guess, at least in my lifetime, I think it's the longest that I can remember. I think as a younger Formula One fan, it was changing all sorts of ways. So this is the most consistent one that we've had for a while. But do we dare enter the territory of a qualifying race for example. We're seeing this in other championships around the world, and Formula One in a brave new era. If we bend the iconic logo of last year, we can just about do anything in Formula One now. Nothing is sacred. I think, it's more than just adding some fantastic music and opening graphics to the package. I think there needs to be some other work in the Friday-Saturday format.
It's an interesting point you raise, actually. I mean, when Formula One raises the spectre of changing qualifying rules, everyone would cast their mind back to, I think it was 2016. The first 2 races, was it, where we had elimination qualifying?
I even forgot about that.
Yeah, because it was such a brief moment of time and we all worked to bleach it from our memories because it was offensive and terrible and no one enjoyed it. And they kept it for 2 whole races, not even just 1. But a qualifying race, I suppose, in many respects, as long as you figure out a way of deciding the grid for that race, which could be done in reverse championship order or whatever, championship order even, that does, I suppose, eliminate a lot of problems for the Grand Prix of Sunday itself, doesn't it? If everyone would just start on a new set of tyres, I guess. Well, maybe that's something that they will be looking at. We know they've considered qualifying races or will be considering qualifying races. It's something that's on the agenda. Other sports have it, like you say. Maybe that's the direction in which we are heading. In terms of the battle for the lead, that was fairly straightforward for Ferrari and Mercedes to qualify on ultra-soft tyres. Again, it shows the pace they had over everybody else, and that gave them a pretty straightforward one-stop strategy ahead of themselves. The only sort of problem Mercedes had as a front row lockout was that Valtteri Bottas was on pole, which is the driver that's not in the championship. Already rumours started immediately that team orders would be enacted at some point. Do you feel like, from Mercedes' perspective, and we'll get into this issue in more detail momentarily, but thinking back to that last front row lockout, I think it was the previous front row lockout for either team, which was the Italian Grand Prix, where Ferrari locked out the front row and managed to completely bungle that race because they didn't seem to want at any point preference any driver. Do you think Mercedes would have been thinking about that when they approached this race?
Yeah, it's a low-risk strategy to let Valtteri Bottas win the Russian Grand Prix, as it were, for Lewis Hamilton's championship aspirations. But Toto Wolff made the perfectly valid point in his team principle. It's very much his responsibility in terms of what orders are dished out. And we saw, on the telecast, we saw the very ominous tactics button. There's a direct line to some kind of tactician on the Mercedes pit wall, and there's no denying what conversation would have gone there. But the whole problem with team orders has reared its ugly head again for the casual Formula One fan. It just confuses people. So us hardcore fans talking about it and listening to this podcast, it's par of the course to do such a thing. But again, another sort of identity crisis that Formula One has. Is it really a good look for the sport? I know we see it in cycling, but we've even got to the stage where cyclists in the Tour de France were using F1 team orders as an analogy in their sport. Which
is ironic when you consider some of the problems that sport has faced.
We'd rather that problem than theirs 10 years ago.
True. Yeah, exactly. I'd be fine with the team orders problem, I think, from here on in. We'll talk about exactly how that unfolded in a moment, because before they could even consider enacting team orders, they had to get past turn 2, which it's an extremely long run down to it, and it's another situation where a turn in Formula One is not really a turn. Turn 1 is not anything. It's just a bend. Everyone rushed down to turn 2. Sebastian Vettel attempted to slipstream Lewis Hamilton. Hamilton slipstreamed Bottas. And as a result, everyone got through that turn in qualifying order. It then got to the first pit stops. The first moment to blink, because even though the ultra softs were more durable, they still were not the optimum race tyre. The soft tyre was the one which could pretty much do the entire race distance without any issues. Valtteri Bottas pit first, but then Sebastian Vettel and Ferrari went for the undercut. Unusually, though, given the undercut's a pretty standard procedure and it's fairly easy to cover them off as well, you just pit on the next lap. Mercedes didn't do it. They left Lewis Hamilton out for an extra lap, so he pitted the lap after Sebastian Vettel did. And that momentarily lost him a position. Weird situation, given I know Valtteri Bottas was obviously in the lead and perhaps they were prepared to let him win at that point, but you still do have your championship fight going on with Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel. Do you feel like they dropped the ball a little bit there? Their eye was a bit distracted in what was ultimately the more important battle of this race.
I don't think so, because we've seen either team make bad calls in races. Ferrari and Mercedes are not immune from that. We're talking about very fine margins here where, Sebastian Vettel only just got ahead of Lewis Hamilton by the slimmest of margins after his pit stop. So it could have gone either way. And in this case, Ferrari very much won that battle. It wasn't a problem a couple of laps later. But, just touching on Valtteri, though, I think, at that point, Valtteri knows, okay, so now Sebastian's ahead of Lewis. I'm in the lead of this Grand Prix. I think the decision has been made for me to win this Grand Prix. So I think, in that essence, I think it was very much not the great. And you could tell that Lewis Hamilton wasn't overly, thrilled by winning that Grand Prix either. He did the sort of very meek attempt to hand Valtteri the trophy, and then Valtteri said, "No, please. I'm still driving," he said, as per the alcohol sponsor. But so everyone would have thought that Valtteri should have had that in the bag, because if Mercedes stuffed it up. But then again, it could have been a case of, okay, well, we've stuffed up Lewis's race in that case. Let's stuff up Valtteri's.
It's got to be fair for both, right? Stuff up one, stuff up
exactly.
both.
So we stuffed up your race, Lewis. Sure, you got the most amount of points, but we had to stuff up Valtteri's in the process. I hope you're okay with that.
Yeah, everyone gets a little bit of the errors that they made. Like you said, didn't last very long, though, for Lewis Hamilton to have net third place behind Sebastian Vettel. I think Vettel made a mistake at turn 13 of that very first lap, Lewis's out lap. That let him follow him around. Turn 2, there was a bit of aggressive defending from Sebastian Vettel. It was cleared by the stewards, that was fine, but Hamilton got past at turn 4. But what he had to do to get past him so quickly was really use those soft tyres very hard and very quickly, considering they'd only just come out of the pit lane. They still needed to be warmed up because they were quite durable for this particular circuit. And suddenly there was a little bit of blistering on that rear left tyre. It's hard you can't really call it mismanagement, because he had to get past Sebastian Vettel when he was vulnerable. But this is kind of the excuse Mercedes used for calling the team orders when Valtteri Bottas obviously wasn't, maybe taking them as easily as they thought perhaps he would. Legitimate excuse, I suppose. Do we want to call it as an excuse? Is it right to call it an excuse? It was completely genuine.
In my opinion, no, because Lewis Hamilton is still the person responsible for enacting the overtake. Sure, he was put in that position by the boffins on the pit wall, but it's up to him to make that pass stick and to do it safely. We'd be telling a completely different story if Vettel and Hamilton got stuck into each other. If Hamilton rear-ended or front-ended Sebastian Vettel in that race, we'd be telling a very different story. If it was Sergio Perez and Esteban Ocon, would have been a safety car for sure in that instance.
It's almost surprising they didn't come together, actually. They're very well behaved when they've had a talking to, aren't the Force India boys? They're very meek about it. The blistering is what ultimately led to the lap 25 decision for Bottas to swap. He did it very obviously. I do like it when a team order is enacted obviously by the driver stopping, as if just to make sure everybody knows that he's being asked to do this. But eventually Sebastian Vettel, he showed that either because Ferrari didn't really have the pace, they were thereabouts, but I think Lewis Hamilton said after the race you need nearly 1.5 seconds advantage to make any passing happen on this track, and Ferrari obviously didn't have that kind of advantage. The threat subsided, at which point obviously Lewis Hamilton had managed the tyres fine in the clear air, which was the idea Mercedes said it had when it wanted to enact that team order. Valtteri Bottas still very much felt like, not that he was owed the victory, but that he'd done enough to earn the victory at this race, and radioed rather forlornly asking whether or not the positions would be switched back. There's obviously the championship context to this. Lewis Hamilton's vying with Sebastian Vettel and Valtteri is not for the Drivers' Championship. But given this was Valtteri's probably cleanest, most complete weekend of the year, I think certainly, do you feel like he was entitled to have that win handed back to him, given the difference between first and second from Lewis Hamilton's perspective was only 7 points? It would have been 43 rather than 50 points over Vettel.
Oh, I think the concept of handing positions back a little bit ridiculous. If you're going to pass someone, do it properly. And if you're going to pass someone, make it stick. So you put in that position. I mean, how many other? Imagine the multi-21 situation in Malaysia. Imagine if they had that altercation, Vettel and Webber, and then okay, I've been told off. You can have it back. It just it ruins a bit of the drama and the spectacle of the sport. And I think we saw that with what the Force India is as well. I think Sergio Perez was saying, Esteban Ocon, he's hopeless. He can't pass the other cars in front. Let me do it. Let me have a crack. And I thought their team radio was... They were very... if Mercedes were very obvious and blasé about it, Force India were very tentative about it, which surprised me given that they had every right to sort of, have a draconian influence over their drivers and tell them, we're paying you to... Well, actually, Sergio's paying them to do all this, but that's a whole other complication in our sport, isn't it?
It's interesting, and this has happened before this season. There's maybe not so much that necessarily has to be read into it, but I find it interesting that Mercedes this year, from what we've heard obviously through the broadcast anyway, has on more than one occasion had people, not the driver engineers, radioing the drivers in situations of, I suppose, attention. We know Austria was the famous one, right? When James Vowles radioed Lewis Hamilton to apologise to him very publicly. And then we had Vowles again on the radio to Bottas, and then also Toto Wolff trying to console him on the warm-down lap. And Toto Wolff says that's because, for some reason, they hadn't discussed exactly this situation with him, where they would all be in the same order and maybe Hamilton needed to be ahead of him for whatever reason. Is it strange to think that Mercedes couldn't have planned this situation, given that surely, I mean, considering everybody was talking about it, whether or not Mercedes thought they were going to do it, the fact that this was not, Valtteri Bottas was perhaps not prepared that this might be the case, that Toto Wolff had perhaps not briefed him that this might be the case. Is that unusual, unexpected, given the points difference?
I think it's a very obvious lack of communication between that team. Everyone had their own idea of what they were going to do for the team in that race, but no one seemed to be talking to each other, which I think is the staggering point. And I think Mercedes' culture is the antithesis of that. They're very much very aligned with each other, and they're very team oriented. But this I don't know. Something seemed lacking in this one. A whole bunch of people had different ideas of their objective for the Grand Prix and their part, and it just didn't seem to come together. But it's and I'm just thinking about this race now. I'm actually getting more and more frustrated for Valtteri. You were spot on. He had the flawless weekend, and for a guy who's building, unfortunately, a bit of a resume as a solid number 2 career driver, the wingman.
Excellent wingman.
Yeah, excellent wingman. There's lots of Tom Cruise memes going around. You don't want that as your reputation Formula One. You want to be on equal footing and be a multiple race winner. And for Valtteri, this is, in terms of his portfolio of Grand Prix, he couldn't get much better than this. And this is a track that's been very kind to him, even in the Williams years as well. He's been very good at this track. I don't know what it is. It's just that magic sort of aura that Sochi brings to Valtteri Bottas' driving. It seems to complement him, and he completely deserved that win. But for whatever reason, just on that day, no one was really thinking the bigger picture. They were only thinking about Lewis Hamilton's points and why they offended him so much, because he said guys on the team radio, which is usually the start of a very long-winded, sarcastic rant.
So looking at some of the other results, because Hamilton won from Bottas, Vettel from Raikkonen, Verstappen and Ricciardo did... I mean, I don't like to understate some of the drives these drivers starting from the back make. Verstappen had an excellent opening 8 laps. He was up to 5th after 8 laps, which was extremely impressive. But even he said afterwards, which I thought was good, that when he's got a car so much faster than the midfield, it's only so impressive. I mean, even Ricciardo managed to make it there, and he'd lost reportedly up to 30 points of downforce because he had a damaged front wing from the first or second lap. So that sort of tells you how much faster that car is inherently. But in 7th place, and it should be said from 7th all the way down to 11th, all the drivers that started on the Hypersoft tyres finished more or less in their position. So where it was a massive disadvantage in Singapore, it was not in Russia. But in 7th place was Charles Leclerc for Sauber. He did this by overtaking some cars, which is always exciting in a race, isn't it? He did it on laps 1 and 2, Ocon and Magnussen. Was this, I mean, he's had so many strong drives this year, but was this really the evidence, the obvious evidence you wanted, that not only can he manage the tyres, he can overtake on tracks you're not meant to overtake on, and finish quite a far way ahead of the rest, that this is the Ferrari man coming?
Do you know what scares me? I thought about this for the first time watching that Grand Prix, because I thought, wow, a Sauber is overtaking a Haas, which is, in the Ferrari pyramid, is the better customer team. But do you recall a certain spectacular Sauber driver some 7 odd years ago? He's now in Force India paying for that seat.
Yeah, being asked to move aside.
Charles Leclerc, he had a sort of a very quiet start to his career, very much coming to grips to Formula in his post-Formula 2 career to F1, and sort of did his thing very quietly. Wasn't spectacular, but wasn't too fast either. Then it just clicked for him. Started visiting the circuits that he ran again, and it was just so impressive to watch him overtaking the Haas with such ease. That car does not belong where it does. And you see that, Marcus Ericsson, very competent driver, but again, he's the sort of middle of the road drivers that just brings it home at the end of the Grand Prix, a reliable set of hands, whereas Charles Leclerc has this intrinsic ability to do just about anything with a car, no matter what. He could be in a Toro Rosso Honda for all we know, probably in the points as well. He could he just adapts to whatever environment that he's in. I really hope it's a case of he is not, he doesn't get the sort of the fear of running for a massive team like Ferrari in his second season in F1 get to him a bit, which is the worry for any young man, any young racing driver that we've seen over the years. We've seen it happen before. I don't think so, but I just want to warn that for people.
Yeah, a valuable comparison perhaps, because everyone was all the rage. Sergio Perez scored podiums for Sauber.
He was overtaking. He overtook Fernando Alonso in the 20.
I think he almost did in Malaysia.
Yeah,
right?
Malaysia in 2012 or 13.
Don't remember. 2012 or 2013. Good question. Write in, strategy report. I don't know what our email address is, but 2012. Just leave a comment on the Facebook group.
I remember I had to catch a flight. I was in a very nervous hurry for that one.
Why won't this race end? And finally, I just want to touch on Renault, because they started with what they thought and what Singapore would have suggested was the superior strategy, the contra strategy, starting Hülkenberg and Sainz on the soft tyre in 11th and 12th. Sainz picked up damage, so he finished pretty much last. So let's move that aside. But Hülkenberg ran what should have been the optimum strategy, finished ahead of only Marcus Ericsson, was overtaken by Romain Grosjean late in the race because Hülkenberg needed to do some serious fuel saving. Renault's on a 5 or 6 year journey to come back to championship competitiveness, so naturally this is when they should be looking at next season, not necessarily this season. Is the team's wobbles at this point in the season, they've yet to really string together a really strong race in this second half of the year, concerning, do you think, given that, they're very much really in the thick of the midfield, not really poking their head above it in the way maybe we expected at the beginning of the season?
Yeah, and they need to practice very much for 2019 with the arrival of Dan Ricciardo. No offense to the likes of Carlos Sainz and Nico Hülkenberg, but Carlos, relatively inexperienced when it comes to Grand Prix racing compared to Dan, certainly in terms of race wins and pole positions. But and Nico Hülkenberg, he's been around the block a while. He knows all the secrets, so he knows how to put together a consistent race weekend. Whereas Dan Ricciardo will have that winner's edge that he brings to that team. As far as I'm aware, he's not bringing any people over from Red Bull Racing to Renault, so it's not like he can just plug and play like when Schumacher went to Ferrari with the likes of Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne and the like back then. So it's a very much a different context for him. So yeah, they'll be focusing on wind tunnel data and designing the car, but you still have Grand Prix to do. That doesn't change. Just because you're going full 24 hours on the CAD machines back at your base in Enstone doesn't mean you have to make the right calls on the pit wall. So that's concerning a little bit. But whether that changes because Dan arrives, I don't think it's that clear cut or that overnight. So yeah, they have a few Grand Prix to really set the trend for next season. And
it will be interesting to see how the balance of the season does pan out in the midfield, which remains far closer than the championship has ended up being. 50 points is the gap Hamilton took away to Vettel from Russia with 5 races remaining. Notwithstanding a possible typhoon in Japan, well, it's hard to bet against Hamilton extending that again next weekend. The Russian Grand Prix sort of went the way you expected it. There was some stuff to talk about, and Rob James, it was a pleasure to talk about it with you.
It was a pleasure to watch the Russian Grand Prix. There was more overtaking than last year, which everyone should be happy with. So it was fun to relive it again with you, Michael.
That was Rob James from F1 podcast Box of Neutrals. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. You can get every episode by subscribing on Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts, and on your favourite podcasting app. And you can also leave a review to help other F1 fans find the show. You can also read the written report at f1strategyreport.com and stay up to date by finding us on Facebook and on Twitter. My name's Michael Lamonato. You can find me at Michael Lamonato on Twitter, and I'll catch you in just a week's time for a look back at the Japanese Grand Prix.